5 tonight. But the next 2 chapters, largely we get to talk about 2 things. 2 things that do impact us in a variety of different ways. But we have, 1, our legacy. We get awfully concerned about the things that we are leaving behind. And typically we have the wrong concept of what we probably should be leaving behind, what we should be blessing our families with. So that'll be one important aspect. And the next one would be faith in the family and some of the considerations of that. We did see the bride being brought to Isaac in the last few chapters. We saw the death of Sarah last week. So now we're going to start transitioning in chapter 25. We're going to move from Abraham to Isaac, as a little bit with Ishmael. We remember Ishmael, the son of Hagar, and we're going to be kind of following that chain down this evening. So, chapter 25. Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letushim, and Leumim. And the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had. And while he was still living, he sent them eastward away from Isaac his son to the country of the east. So last week we discussed the death of Sarah. And here we see Abraham marrying again. What essentially is, in verse 6, one of his concubines. We often get kind of a funny idea. We see concubine used in a variety of different ways, especially as we move through the Old Testament. We typically see it as a negative connotation, especially when we get to David and Solomon, some of the sons of David, some of the other issues that we see through the Word. What we're really dealing with here with Abraham is something of a lesser wife. Someone who has particular duties, kind of like Hagar, but now we see that he marries Keturah. And we see that Abraham is pretty well aged at this point. And a lot of people really kind of get the idea, well, why? 125 years old plus. Why the marriage to Abraham? No doubt that Keturah and Abraham love one another. But you have to remember that Abraham was a rich man. Everybody in the land was always kind of wary. You remember Abimelech of Gerar a few chapters ago that Abraham had deceived. Abraham had 318 plus trained men. He was very wealthy. He was very well known, and it made anybody else, the kings or the rulers of the land, it made them a little bit nervous. So he marries, and we very briefly see that lineage, and we'll revisit the lineages here in a minute. But we still see Abraham moving in faith. We talked about the concept of the legacy and the things that we pass down, the things that we should be passing down to our children. Abraham had other children. We remember Ishmael and Abraham having a really hard time sending away Ishmael and Hagar because it was still his son. And we still saw some of the back and forth a little bit, didn't we? When we see God reiterating the covenant, the promise, it will be through Isaac. But what does Abraham say? Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Not that God was going to kill Ishmael, but he wanted Ishmael to receive the covenant. Why? Because it was normal. The firstborn got the best stuff. The firstborn, by birthright, got a double portion of the inheritance. Typically, the firstborn would get the double portion. He would become the spiritual leader of the household, but he would also be kind of like the head of the family. He would be the one kind of making all the decisions. You remember when Abram left Ur, the land of the Chaldees, and Lot went with him. The rest of the families went with him, but you see kind of Abraham calling all the shots. We don't see that bantering in Abraham now. And we really haven't in some time. After his test at Mount Moriah, we see kind of just more of a solidarity to Abraham. So talking about legacy, we see Abraham at this point protecting the covenant to an extreme degree, and it's kind of interesting. The covenant was from him and Sarah, the two of them, through their son Isaac. That was going to be the line of the promise, right? We remember that concept. It didn't bother him twice. You remember when he first left the northern area through Canaan, didn't even really do much of a pit stop through Canaan, just kept on going down to Egypt. And he ran into Pharaoh. What was Abraham's backup plan for everything? If anybody asked, you're my sister. And everything's going to be well. So Pharaoh took Sarah into the harem. God protected the covenant and plagued the house of the Pharaoh. And we saw Abraham get rebuked. Some number of years later, he travels into the region of Gerar, into the land of the Philistines. And he does the same thing. He tells Abimelech, that's my sister. She ends up in the harem of Abimelech. And God tells Abimelech, indeed, you're a dead man because you have taken a married man's wife. And he shut up the wombs of the Philistine women. God protected the covenant. Here in verses 5 and 6, now we see Abraham taking steps to protect the covenant. He says first that he gave all that he had to Isaac. So not just the physical inheritance, all of the stuff that Abraham had, but also the concept of the promise, the covenant, that the land that they are in, that he didn't want Isaac to leave, that was going to go to Isaac. But he does two other things. In verse 6, he still blesses and gives gifts to the rest of his children. He makes sure they're taken care of. But he also makes sure, he takes that step, you notice in the end of verse 6, that he sent all those kids eastward, out of the land. The reason for his doing is to make sure he's protecting Isaac and protecting the covenant. Verse 7, this is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. It's interesting that he was called an old man since he was 75. 70 years old when we see him leaving Mesopotamia, and everybody called him an old man. Sarah, in a good deal of those chapters, calls him an old man twice per chapter. 175 years old, and I really like how it describes him, that he was full of years. If you notice in your Bibles, because it's not in the original text, you see of years kind of in the italics. He died, an old man, and was full. Such an amazing concept, isn't it? How do we determine full? It kind of changes based off of the era of our life. In my 20s, full was different than I was 15. Full was different when I turned 30. Full looks a lot different now. So it's interesting that it kind of changes, but I really think it's important that we keep it in context. What we see full, or our concept of full, what's the first thing that really hits our minds? We don't need anything. We don't really want anything. I have nothing but happiness and sparkles and rainbows in my life. I've made all my kids wealthy. I got my PhD, whatever it is that's in your bucket that makes you full. But if you look in Abraham's bucket, you see things that we don't want in our bucket. What was it that made Abraham full? How many trials and tests did Abraham have? He had a lot, and some substantial ones. How many lessons did he have to learn the hard way? He was rebuked by Pharaoh, and all through the word, and that would be the hard one, the man who is called the friend of God, the father of faith, this great man of faith. He was rebuked by Pharaoh and by Abimelech. We see him ride off in the middle of the night against 4 victorious armies with 318 men and win. That's something we would like in our column, wouldn't it? On our headstones, mighty warrior. That'd be kind of awesome. We see him refuse the king of Sodom's desire to bless him with a bunch of riches, but he takes the solemn oath. I won't take anything from you, lest any man say that he made Abraham rich. Then the very next chapter, how's that next chapter start off? Abraham, don't be afraid. He was afraid because he cast off that extra protection, cast off that extra riches. Did he maybe make another enemy? Those 4 kings that he just whooped up on, what if they decide to come back in the daytime and find out that Abraham's really not that big? We have those tests. Then we have the test of the calling to take Isaac, his son, to Mount Moriah and offer him up. We see him waiting for about 30 plus years, for the promise and fulfillment that he would have a son. We see Abraham living his life as a pilgrim. We see Abraham on multiple occasions building altars in a great deal of locations that he'd been to, but he never built himself a house. So we see kind of a completely different concept of full from Abraham. But one of the biggest things that we should be seeing when we look in his bucket, and what everybody else should be seeing when they look in ours, is he had a real relationship with God. It's a game changer for us. So Abraham dies full and was gathered to his people. We're going to see that a lot in the Old Testament. That when certain kings or prophets, here with Abraham, Ishmael, and we see people die, we're going to see that phrase, they were gathered to his people. We see it expounded on in the book of Luke. I don't remember what chapter it was, but we see it called Abraham's bosom. Why was he gathered to his people instead of going to heaven? Christ hasn't come yet. So we see everybody being gathered up in Abraham's bosom first, until the death, burial of the Messiah. We remember Jesus in his teachings, he said that just as Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the beast, so too must the Son of Man. So that's what Jesus was doing. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, we see the 2 brothers coming back together again, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass, after the death of Abraham, that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahai-roi, place or well of the God who hears and sees. This is where Isaac is. We saw Isaac when he was waiting for his bride. That's where he went out into the field to pray, or went out to the field to meditate, when he saw his wife for the first time. And we see God blessing Isaac. We still see kind of that continuation of the covenant. Now this is the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservant, bore to Abraham. And these were the names of the sons of Ishmael, by their names according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael, Nebaljoth, then Kedar, Adbeel, Midsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jetur, Nephish, and Kedemah. Again, as always, if any of you guys are expecting me looking for good Bible names, chapter 25 has got a whole list of them. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these were their names by their towns and their settlements. 12 princes according to their nations. The genealogies in the Bible always fascinates me for 2 reasons. First off, we always skip them. Just about everywhere you go, they skip them. They won't even read the names. You get a lot of guys just like me that can't properly read the names. And you miss a lot of information in there. You really do. to the reason for the genealogies. Now, the genealogies that are given for the Messiah, that makes sense. When we're given genealogies in Matthew and Luke, and they look different, there's a reason for them. One drawing through the line of Mary, one drawing through the line of David. You figure out there's something in David's line that probably shouldn't be there, and you go through Mary's line, and you finish tracking all the way down. You see very interesting names in the genealogies. For example, the Midianites that come from Ishmael. We're going to see those guys in Genesis chapter 37, 38, 39 in there somewhere. They're the ones that take Joseph down into Egypt. So you get to see kind of some neat stuff in there. But when it's a lineage of the Messiah, that makes sense. The whole Bible is kind of what it's tracking, all the way up until his birth. So we understand why those genealogies are in there. The Bible doesn't really care about anybody else's genealogies, which is why it doesn't really track them. So it should really ask the question, why do I care about the genealogies of Ishmael? They're still at war with the Jews. He's going to be a wild man. His hand is going to be against everybody. Why do we care about the genealogy of Ishmael? Because it shows the grace of God, and it shows that God fulfills his promises. In chapter 17, verse 20, which is back this way somewhere. Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Then God said, "No, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." The reason why, and this isn't going to be the last one, the reason why we see the genealogy of Ishmael, all 12 names of the 12 princes, is demonstrating that God kept his promise. These were the years, verse 17, of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt, as you go toward Assyria. He died in the presence of all his brethren. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. You have to remember, Laban wasn't from Syria, but that's where he goes. We see Laban before. We see him in the southern region of Mesopotamia. He decided to uproot and go on his own little trek. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. So let's go back to talking about legacy and things we should be seeing in the home. We see Isaac doing what he was taught. Isaac had a question or a concern or a worry, whatever word you want to stick in there, about the covenant. Isaac and Rebekah will be married 20 years before she conceives. We see that in verse 26. After his brother came out and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob, Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So nearly 20 years. Isaac is essentially, not as dramatically, but Isaac was in the same boat that his father was in. His father had a long time waiting. God said, "You're going to be the father of many nations." First key step, you got to have a kid. So Abraham's waiting and waiting and waiting. And we see where the waiting gets harder and harder and harder. What does Abraham and Sarah do? They start to doubt. They start to question. You can just kind of just hear the conversation. "Abraham, baby, what exactly did God say to you?" Well, he said that I'm going to have a son. That you're going to have a son. He didn't say I was going to have a son. He said you're going to have a son. Here's Hagar. We're just going to speed up this point. God needs a little bit of our help. Here's Hagar, and we saw what a thorn in the side that was for Abraham, for Sarah, for Hagar, and a continuation of it, as Ishmael is the father of the Arab nations. So Isaac does what he knows that he is supposed to do. He prays. He prays to God concerning his wife, the honor of his wife, because you have to remember especially since Genesis chapter 9, a woman that is barren can't fulfill that command to go forth and multiply. So if she is barren, she is cursed. And he's also praying on the promises of God. Such an important aspect to bring into the home. You want to pass down a proper legacy. It really should deal less with stuff and more with a relationship with God. At the forefront for Isaac is the covenant. And you have to remember Isaac's testimony at Mount Moriah. Everyone thinks that Isaac was a young boy when he was taken to the mountain to be offered up. But the word lad means young man. He could have been anywhere from 13 to 30. So he'd lived through a breath of this already. So he has the covenant at the forefront of his mind, but he also has his wife at the forefront of his mind. And he's dealing with both of those through prayer, not his own plotting and scheming and measures of his flesh. The Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If all is well, why am I like this?" That's an honest question. If everything's going the way that it should be, and this is the one that really trips us up, and we'll deal with it again in the Mark chapter 4, those of you that are going to be here Sunday morning. If everything's going the way that it's supposed to, this is what God has ordained, why is it so hard? Well, if it's really hard, that means it's really wrong. It's not supposed to look like this. Everything's supposed to be really easy. This is going to be another child of promise. That's an easy mistake to make. Sometimes the things that God calls us into, they're fiercely easy. And it's fantastic. But it's a bad idea to assume that it's always going to be that way. So when it's hard, and we have that foolish mentality that if it's God's way, it's going to be super easy, what do we do when it's hard? This ain't right. Time to abandon mission. Plan B. This is what we're going to do instead. Or we panic about it. We stress over it. How many of us, when we try and go to sleep and there's just that itch, there's just something. We can't sleep and we just start hashing it out. And by the time it's 6 o'clock and the rooster's crowing, we've gone through 100 different scenarios and how we're going to solve at least 90 of them. And it just reduces the years of our life. That's not what she does. So she went to inquire of the Lord. Man, that's just smart already. Prayer being our first weapon against everything. But I doubt very much there's anything more powerful than a husband and wife praying team. And I believe that because the enemy fights so fiercely to wreck marriages. He'll use anything to divide up marriages. A husband and wife working together, I don't know, just everything that I've seen in the ministry in the last several years, just the amazing work that God does through that team is just remarkable. And it teaches something very powerful to your kids, to your neighbors. For a husband and wife to truly come together and pray together, they are a team. We've already talked about the concept of the church trying to take down walls just so we can pray together. Because when you pray together as a church, like we do Sunday mornings at 9:30, we have our little prayer group on the couches, people start to learn about your theology. People start to learn about your personal life. People start to learn about your quirks because sometimes things just slip. Lord, my husband, he hasn't quite figured it, just slap him on the head. It's hard to let down those walls. Sometimes walls just get let down automatically, and it just is what it is. But for a husband and wife to do that, we already know that there is just right out the gate because of our flesh, a natural barrier of for communication between the husband and the wife. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or whatever it was a book from the 80s. We do things different. We think things different. We say things different. One group, I can't believe, doesn't die off faster than the other one. Some of the ideas that I've had as a husband have just not been that great. Thanks, Kyle. We see them both inquiring of the Lord. So that's great for the team. But for the kids, what is it they get to witness? Typically, in a home, they have one aspect of it. Dad is the judge, while mom is the one with always the soft hand, or dad is the one that only does this, while mom's the only one that does that. And there's going to be those divisions, some of them natural, some of them just have to be there, whatever the case may be. But when they see both pursuing God, and they see both praying, they see both in a hard time, a hard situation that's bothering them, both of them pursuing God. And just imagine that kind of lesson. So both kids, there's kind of a war in the womb. She says, well, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went and inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. That would have been a shocker. What is God saying? There are 2 children in your womb. There are twins. Both of them are going to be the fathers of nations. And because they're warring with each other, we kind of get an insight as to their relationship. Those of us who have already obviously read ahead, we understand that between the Israelites and the Edomites, and the wars that have come back and forth, and the slaveries that have come back and forth between the two. But he's telling her, you have 2 kids in your womb. They're going to be the fathers of 2 nations, and those nations are going to be at war. We see them getting a head start. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Now, it's easy for us to jump right in. It's like, well, it makes sense that God chose Jacob. Jacob, we're going to see, has just somewhat more of an inclination towards spiritual things. If you keep reading, what do you find out about Jacob? That dude's a dirtbag. What do you find out about Esau? That dude's a dirtbag too. Paul made it perfectly clear in Romans chapter 9, verses 10 through 13, which wasn't that long ago for us. God chose in his sovereignty, before they were born, before they even had a chance to do anything wrong, God is setting a pattern. And what I really love about it, going back to our concept of leaving behind a legacy. We like to leave behind a worldly one. When I die, Sai's going to get the car, because Kai is probably going to be a bad driver. So he's going to get my truck and my Subaru. Kai can drive the one that Megan's driving. Kai is going to get all the money, because she's probably going to be better at finance. We pick that way. But because Kai is the oldest, but she's a girl, so everything's going to go to Sai. That's how it would have happened in the times of Abraham. Everything should have gone to Esau, who's going to come out first. But God is saying that the older is going to serve the brother. Here we see God establishing a pattern against, or contrary, is probably a better word, contrary to the world system. Sometimes the stuff God does just doesn't make sense, except to God. And we see it often. He chose the foolish things to confound the wise. He's going to set a precedence. The covenant, the lineage of the Messiah did not go through the firstborn. The rescuer of the sons of Jacob didn't come through the firstborn, but rather second to last, through Joseph. The one being second to last proved to be one of the most powerful pictures and types of Christ that we have in the book of Genesis. So you can just imagine the problem that in the flesh this can create. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed, there were twins in her womb. I like how it says it. Almost like with just a Scotia surprise. And the first came out red. He was hairy. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. And depending on how you pronounce Esau, you can get hairy, Esau, or Edom, red. So he came out He's dressed like a Wookiee, so I was like, you know what? That's what your name's going to be. Harry. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. This is important. This is one of those things that you really, in my Bible, I highlight it in green. But he takes hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob, which means like heel catcher, to trip up. He's already trying to get one over on his brother. Oh, you came out first? You don't get the inheritance. I'm going to get the. So he's trying to trip up his brother. So he called his name Jacob. So one's Harry and one's Cheat. I'd avoid those names. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Partiality will create dissension in the family. 2 sons. One is a skillful hunter. When you're choosing someone to take the inheritance, that's going to be the sheik or like the head of the family, you want the tough one. You want the one that no matter what happens, he's just going to survive it. He is a mighty hunter. It makes sense that Isaac was more partial to Esau. Esau would go out, hunt, bring back food that the dad really loved to enjoy. I tell you what, there's nothing better than a bowl of like venison stew. Love deer meat, elk meat. Just game is just delicious. We're going to encourage that one. But then we see Jacob. Jacob's more of like the mama's boy, the barista. I just imagine Jacob in the tent with his apron and a man bun. Like that's just how I see. That's just how I see Jacob. For the record, for all of you history fans, man buns, do you know why they came about? Yeah, very good. If I had a gold star, I'd give you a gold star. Samurai saying keep their helmets on proper, instead of making them look like they're supposed to fit. Anyway, so we see that one parent favors the one. We see Isaac favoring the child that's not supposed to receive the inheritance, a mistake that Abraham made with Ishmael. We see Rebekah favoring the child that stays in the home, who's supposed to receive the covenant. So we can see kind of a 4-way paradigm of the dissension that's going to take place in the house, which we'll come back to verse 28 in a couple of chapters. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore his name was called Edom, red. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." Interesting concept. I think it was Barnhouse that makes the statement that Esau was trying to sell something that wasn't his, and Jacob's trying to buy something that was already his. We see this phase of bartering. We see Esau, Jacob, and Isaac, essentially, all assuming that Esau is going to be the one to receive the blessing and the birthright. Dissension does some powerfully ugly things in the family. And we see Jacob, and we will see Rebekah doing things that shouldn't be done. We talked about, a few weeks ago, we talked about an unright order in Israel when David was supposed to be reigning. Instead of reigning, already anointed, already chosen to be the king, what does David spend his time doing instead? Running. Even though he had the promise, instead of waiting for God to fulfill what he said he was going to fulfill, we take matters into our own hands. That's not the legacy. I would much rather look at my kids and let them know if God said he's going to do it, he's got it. Stop putting things in God's hands and trying to take it back. Put it there, leave it there. If God's put it on his heart, it's in his revealed will, there's no sense in trying to do it yourself. All you're going to do is mess it all up anyway. That's the legacy I want to pass down. Not, hey, guess what I did for myself. self-made man or YOLO or whatever nonsense is out right now. Instead, we see Jacob seeing a weakness in his brother Esau and exploiting it. And Esau said, "Look, I am about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" Esau has no inclination toward spiritual things, but we see that Jacob does. So it's at least a good thing in Jacob's favor, even though we see him doing it the wrong way. But when we're talking about the birthrights, we're talking about the blessings. We see the passing of a double portion of the inheritance. We see that he would become the head of the family. We see that he would become the spiritual leader of the family. What we'll be dealing with later on is who is going to inherit the covenant. That was the big deal. Who's going to inherit the covenant? I think Jacob understood how the two were tied together. Esau, probably not so much. To inherit the promised land, all of that land. And he says, "Look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" That's a hard statement, isn't it? He's not just saying, in effect, because we see more commentary on it in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, "I'm just so hungry right now, I can't eat that. I can't eat my birthright." So that's the first side. But the second one is, I'm going to die anyway. What good is all this lineage, mumbo jumbo, and everything else? I need food right now. We get that way. Guzik makes an interesting point that we still trade our birthright. A birthright is laid out for us in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. We trade spiritual blessings, being chosen in Christ, being adopted. We forfeit redemption, forgiveness, grace. We forfeit these blessings, these birthrights, for something temporal, something temporary, something passing. We mock Esau wrongly. He's trading away so much stuff for food. Man, I hope that was a good bowl of chili, because look at all this stuff that he lost. And it says that he sought it afterwards with tears, and he still couldn't find it, is what the author of Hebrews tells us in chapter 12. Yeah, we do that. To gratify and to fulfill the flesh immediately, what have we chosen to do? What's interesting, and the one that, for whatever reason, is just prevalent in my mind at the moment, adultery. Doing marital counseling, looking at surveys and studies of adultery. There's like a big couple of answers that always comes up. It didn't mean anything. It was an accident. It just kind of happened. That's not what I want. This is what I want. And we see kind of that. So you traded something trivial just to fulfill the flesh immediately, forsaking the things that could have been. We do the same thing in the spirit. When we choose that sin or that snare, whatever it is in your lives, ahead of our spiritual birthright, in effect, we're trying to do the same thing. Then Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. It's interesting, the things that you cast away all of a sudden become something that you despise. We see Jacob being concerned with the spiritual things, but Esau valuing more of the material things. What is your legacy? How are you known? Not just to your kids. How about your grandkids, your nieces, your nephews, your neighbor, that weird person in line behind you at Albertsons? I think Greg Laurie in a recent teaching said, how do people, see you? If they see you, do they want to learn more about Jesus or less? Probably a little bit paraphrased. Interesting concept. The legacy that we should be trying to press down to our kids is that they would look in us, at us, through us, and want to know Jesus more. We see this so far. Verse 26, we have something different to talk about. But we see this in Isaac so far. Things are hard with his wife. He prays. Rebekah, things are hard in her womb. She prays. Abraham, seeing the things afar off that could make difficult the path of Isaac, he deals with it right away. He sorts his affairs in his household, protecting the covenant beforehand, before his passing. His focus, Isaac's focus, Rebekah's focus is more on the spiritual aspect of things. Remember how deep it went when Isaac sent the unnamed servant, later we probably see that it's Eleazar, to go fetch a wife 900 miles away, or 450 miles away if you're going in a straight line. The servant says something that makes sense. Who's going to come back with me to the middle of nowhere and marry a random dude? This is worse than the whole concept of dating online. Like, this is just way worse. They couldn't even do pictures. They would be a smiley face and some hair in the sand. 900 miles. Look, I got donkeys. I got camels. So you know he's real. So he says, well, Master, how about I just take your son back to Mesopotamia? Hey, here's the cow. Do you want to buy it? And Abraham says, swear to me, you do not take my son back to my people. This is the land that we were given. This is the land that God is going to bless us in. We're staying right here. You go bring him back. God's going to send his angels ahead of you. That is faith. That is the legacy that we should be trying to pass down to our kids. That's a legacy or a seed that we can plant in our friends. One of faith. One focused on spiritual things. I got to tell you, it's a lot more freeing to be focused on spiritual things, the things that God has, than on material things, which is typically a pile of junk that you don't have. Then once you do finally get it, what do you got to do? I got to figure out a way to keep it. It's a nightmare. Instead of don't worry about all the things that you do need, those are going to be added to you, Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 6. A spiritual legacy is the one to behold, and that's the one to pass down. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you so much for an evening, for blessing our evening together, God, for allowing us to gather as free men and women to worship and to praise you, Lord. Thank you so much, God, for preserving your word for us, for showing the ups of our Bible heroes, but also, God, showing us the downs of the Bible heroes. We always seem to find a track or a pattern in some of the years of our lives written in the pages. And thank you, Lord, for showing us, demonstrating to us the same spiritual truth. You are never dethroned.